Alright, these next few lectures I want to talk about egoism. And egoism is this claim that human beings are or should be self-interested, right? And, I want to talk about it because, some people take this to be obvious, right? And it also seems like it poses a threat to ethics as we usually conceive of it. Now, I don't know that it is obvious, but some people think that it is. We'll talk a bit more about these questions later. But so why does it pose a challenge to ethics as we usually think of it? Why is egoism a threat? Well, because it seems that morality and self-interest often clash. Let me give you guys an example. Um, Once years ago, first time I was ever in New York, early 20s, I was still in school, I was pretty broke. I was in a drugstore, I forget why, and I dropped my wallet. I mean, stupid thing, I don't know how I did it. I dropped my wallet in the drugstore, don't realize I don't have my wallet till I'm outside. I mean, luckily I was close enough to the friend's house where I was staying. I could walk back to it. I didn't even have a subway card. And, I'm sitting there, like, I cancel all my bank cards. I am a friend to feel sorry for. I'm just drinking a beer, feeling sorry for myself. And I get a call on my cell phone, and it's this woman who picked up my wallet, like found out who I was. This is a couple hours later. She took a couple hours worth of effort. You know, she couldn't figure out my number. She found my mom's number. She called my mother, who told her what it was. And then she called me and says, "Oh, I have your wallet." She then waits for me at her apartment. This is right off of Fifth Avenue. This woman was loaded, so like it was, like she really didn't have much temptation to take my money. But still, this took a couple of hours worth of her time. She didn't need to do that, right? She could have just left it there. The right thing to do, we think, is, well, if you see somebody's wallet, definitely don't pick it up and steal the money. But, ideally, you should call them, you should get in touch with them, you should do what this woman did. But it doesn't seem like it was in her self-interest, right? How can wasting a couple hours of your time to get this squirrely person's wallet back to him, how can that be in your interest, right? Your interest is either just take it and take the cash out and throw it away, or just leave it there, right? Morality says don't steal, and probably you should try to get this back to the person. Self-interest seems to say, just take it or just leave it if you don't need the money. Lots of times our self-interest seems like it would be served by lying. Morality says don't lie, or at least don't lie except exceptional circumstances, right? Lying to somebody to get money because you need money and it would help you out, that might be in your self-interest. Morality wouldn't say it's a good thing. It would say it's off the table. So egoism, this idea that we are or should be self-interested, seems like it would require us to seriously rethink, if not even flat out discard, our usual morality. So it seems like a real challenge to morality. But is egoism true? Now you guys might have noticed, if you're really attentive listeners, you might have noticed he keeps saying we are or should be self-interested. Those seem like two different statements. That seems like really vague. Which does he mean? Well, and that's actually on purpose, because I think people can and do mean different things by egoism. And one of the things that you should always do in a philosophy class when you're talking about something is to get very clear on what you mean. And the first distinction I think we should make when talking about egoism is between psychological egoism. Human beings are self-interested. They do act from self-interest, right? Recognizably, and if you remember Vaughn's distinction, recognizably not a moral claim, versus ethical egoism. Human beings should act from self-interest. Acting in one's self-interest is the morally right thing to do. Recognizably a moral claim, right? One is describing how people act. The other is saying how they should act. Now look, let's ask ourselves, are either of these true? Well, we'll start with psychological egoism, but first, I want to say a little bit about the relationship between the two. It seems hard to argue for ethical egoism on the face of it, right? Morality does seem to require that we give things up, that we act contrary to our self-interest sometimes. Well, so why would anybody be an ethical egoist? It seems like a weird theory. Well, if psychological egoism is true, it would actually give us a pretty powerful argument that ethical egoism is true, or that, there's different varieties of ethical egoism, so, it'd be more accurate to say, if psychological egoism is true, it gives us a powerful argument that, some form of ethical egoism is going to be the only good moral theory. Well, okay, so why is that? Well, this is because what philosophers sometimes call the ought implies can principle. And I really don't like this way of putting it. A better and more memorable way to put this would probably be to say the should requires could principle. And what this means is that it doesn't make any sense to say that we should do something unless we can actually do it. If it is humanly impossible to do something, we can't say that people should do it, right? If you cannot do it, we cannot hold you morally accountable for it. Well, what this means, among other things, is that whatever morality tells us to do, whatever a moral theory tells us to do, must be something we can actually do, right? We don't hold anybody in the current age responsible for not stopping Hitler's rise to power. Why? It is, as far as we know, impossible for any of us to travel back in time and do anything about it, right? If something is impossible for you to do, if you cannot do it, it would just be bizarre for a moral theory to say you should do it in any real sense, right? In any sense where we say it guides your actions or we praise or blame you for doing or not doing it. Alright, so the ought implies can principle. Keep that in mind because that's going to come up a few times in the course. This will actually be pretty important. Kant makes a lot of this when we get to Kant in a few weeks. So, in light of this, one principle here is if a moral theory requires that we do something that is not possible for us, we should reject the theory. A good moral theory should not ask us to do anything that is impossible for us. Well, so this principle actually gives you an argument from psychological egoism to ethical egoism. So the argument, kind of a long one, but let's go through it. If psychological egoism is true, then it is not possible for us to act for any reasons besides self-interested reasons. If a moral theory requires that we do something that is not possible for us to do, we should reject the theory. Remember, that was our principle here we got from this should requires could. Moral theory can't tell us we should do it unless we can do it. Alright. If a moral theory requires that we do something that is impossible for us, we should reject the theory. All theories except forms of ethical egoism require that we act for reasons besides self-interested reasons, right? It's what a theory is. It's what it is for a theory to be a form of ethical egoism. Says that self-interest is the reason you should act. Any theory that's not ethical egoism is going to say there are other selfless, self-sacrificing reasons we should do things, right? So 4, if psychological egoism is true, then we should reject all moral theories except ethical egoism. Why? Because if psychological egoism is true, this argument says all the other theories are going to ask us to do something impossible, so we should reject them. 5, psychological egoism is true. 6, so the true moral theory must be some form of ethical egoism. Now, I will go on and tell you this is a valid argument. Well, so then is it a good argument? No, remember, for an argument to be good, for a deductive argument to be good, it has to be sound. And to be sound, it has to be the case that not only is the argument valid, but all the premises are true, right? Validity says if an argument has if it has true premises, conclusion can't be false. Validity doesn't tell us if the argument has true premises. So are these premises all true? Go through and think about it and ask yourself, do you accept these? Do you think they're true? If not, which ones do you find suspicious? Now, and I'll give you, let me count to like 5. Silently, you don't want to listen to me just counting on here. Let me count to 5, just give you a few seconds to think about this. Alright, so which ones are suspicious? I don't think 1 and 2 are, right? We'll come back to 1. It might need a bit more refinement, but these are just drawing out the implications of our definitions. The same is true of 3, right? Just the way we define ethical egoism, right? The theory says that the only reasons that work for us, or we should act, are self-interested reasons. Well, it is a form of ethical egoism. So that just goes from the definition. 4 is just a consequence of what come before. Well, but the big one here is 5, right? Is psychological egoism true? I think 5 is the most dubious premise. I think it's the one we should think about the most. I think we should also be a little skeptical about 1, right? It's maybe not as bad, but we should say, well, is it really true if psychological egoism is true? It's not possible for us to act for any reasons besides self-interested reasons. Well, to answer both of these, whether psychological egoism is true and whether it really commits us to what 1 says, we should ask ourselves a little bit more, what do we mean by psychological egoism? Is the term as clear as we think it is? I actually think it's not. And I think you can split psychological egoism into weak psychological egoism, or you might say moderate psychological egoism, and strong psychological egoism. Probably different forms of psychological egoism are going to fall on a line between these two, but this distinction will do the work we need. Weak or moderate psychological egoism says human beings often act for self-interested reasons. Strong psychological egoism says people always act for selfish reasons. Human nature is such that we can only act for self-interested reasons, it might say. Let's ask ourselves, is weak psychological egoism true? Do you think this is an acceptable claim? I actually think weak psychological egoism is true. I don't even think you need an argument for it. If you said weak psychological egoism is true, and I said it's not, I think the burden of proof would be on me because it's just such an obvious claim. But, remember, burden of proof is the person who has to make their case. Well, but look, if you did have to give some evidence for weak psychological egoism, it's not hard to do it, right? If you want to know why people do something, a lot of times it's because it's in their self-interest, right? Why do we pay people to go to work? We want to make doing work in their self-interest, right? Why are you taking a class? If I ask you guys, most of you would probably give some self-interested reason. It is really not hard at all to find evidence for weak psychological egoism, that people often do act in what they take to be their self-interest. Okay, but is weak psychological egoism enough to make the argument work? Weak psychological egoism, human beings often act for self-interested reasons. Well, look, weak psychological egoism won't even get you premise 1. If weak psychological egoism is true, then it is impossible for us to act for any reasons besides self-interested reasons. Well, weak psychological egoism never says that, right? It never says you can't act for reasons that aren't self-interested. It just says we often act for self-interested reasons. In fact, weak psychological egoism doesn't even say that, you know, when morality asks us to do something not in our self-interest, that we usually fail to do it, right? I mean, might be the case that that's true, but that's not what weak psychological egoism says. It just says we often act for self-interested reasons. Weak psychological egoism will not make this argument work. Premise 1 requires something stronger. Premise 1 requires actually strong psychological egoism. If human nature is such that we can only act for self-interested reasons, then it really is true. It's just, by definition, it is not possible for us to act for any reasons besides self-interested reasons. So we need strong psychological egoism to make the argument work. So weak psychological egoism not going to make our argument work. Only strong psychological egoism will do that. So let's actually, edit our argument, change a little word, say if strong psychological egoism is true, first premise, fifth premise, strong psychological egoism is true. Well, that makes premise 1 true. But is premise 5 true, right? Is strong psychological egoism true? So is strong psychological egoism true? Let me ask you guys this. If someone says that it is, who has the burden of proof? If they say people always act selfishly or for self-interested reasons, or human nature is such that people can only act for self-interested reasons, who has the burden of proof for a claim like that? Is it the person who's saying it's true or the person who's denying it? Well, obviously, it's the person saying strong psychological egoism is true, right? The person making the more controversial or extraordinary claim has the burden of proof. Saying that people can never act for any reason except selfish reasons, human nature is such that we can only act for self-interested reasons, that obviously is a very controversial, extraordinary claim. It's much more controversial and extraordinary than just saying, well, no, people sometimes act for reasons that aren't self-interested, right? Well, okay. What evidence is there for the truth of strong psychological egoism? There's not much. Some people will say, well, economics shows that people are self-interested. It actually doesn't. Economists will tell you, it's like, well, we assume that people are generally self-interested because it makes our theory easier. We're talking about the marketplace. You get good predictions if you do this. We know it's not strictly true, but we make the assumption because it gives us a neater theory. So, A, they admit it's not true. B, it's just an assumption they make to get a neater theory. That's not really proof that a claim's true, right? Some people will say that evolution implies it. I don't know, that's a really controversial reading of the theory of evolution. Besides those two, it's really, really, really hard to actually find any evidence for strong psychological egoism. And there's a lot of evidence against. Think about my wallet example, right? How in the world is it in this woman's self-interest? I am sure there's things she'd rather be doing than spending 2 hours finding this squirrely 20-something who lost his wallet. And you might say, oh, she just did it because she got a good feeling about herself. Well, okay, I don't know. I don't know that that's true, but even if it is, if she were really selfish or self-interested, she wouldn't care about helping me, right? To get a good feeling about helping a stranger, you actually have to care about that stranger, right? If you're just self-interested, you'd see the wallet on the ground and be like, sucks for that poor sucker, or grab it and take the money out. You wouldn't care what happened to me. You wouldn't care if I were grateful. You wouldn't care if I got the wallet back. For it to even make you happy that you helped me out or that I'm grateful, you can't be purely self-interested, right? That just seems weird. You know, then there's these Congressional Medal of Honor winners who get killed or risk death, right? They do these things that, you know, just incredibly brave things in war that often get them killed, or if not, they have a very good chance of getting them killed. There are extreme altruists. Larissa McFarquhar has a really good book on these people. People who donate kidneys to strangers. People who donate all their money to ease suffering. There's one guy who moves to the middle of a jungle. He was rich. He starts a leper colony. Lives in poverty, right? Why would you do any of these things if you were acting purely from self-interest? Now look. Psychological egoist can give you, a strong psychological egoist can give you some kind of explanation for these things. It can say, well, you know, the guy gives a kidney, he just, you know, he wants the adulation that comes from the public. He thinks he'll get something out of it. You know, Congressional Medal of Honor winners, the happiness they get from, you know, diving on a live grenade in those 1 second before they get blown to bits, they just think that's greater than the happiness they would get living to a ripe old age. I mean, look, A, that seems crazy. B, I don't know why they would do it if they really only cared about themselves, but strong psychological egoists will say, well, I've got an explanation. But it's not a very good explanation, right? Look, outside of math and pure logic, it is very rare that we can show that a claim could not possibly be true. But we can pretty well know, right? Look, a clever, strong psychological egoist can maybe try to explain to you how some apparently selfless act is in the person's perceived self-interest. A clever defense lawyer could probably spin some yarn about why, even though his client's innocent, he was in the room with the bloody knife standing over the murder victim who he threatened to kill the day before, right? You know, you shouldn't believe that story. If you were on a jury, you know, clever defense attorney can tell a story doesn't mean you shouldn't convict, right? And just because a clever psychological egoist can tell some really implausible story doesn't mean we shouldn't decide that psychological egoism is not true. We don't need to take it seriously even any more than we need to take that attorney's story about how his innocent client was in the room with the bloody knife standing over the body of the person he threatened to kill the day before, right? You'd laugh at him. I think we probably should laugh at the strong psychological egoist. A, he has the burden of proof and he doesn't make it. B, even if he didn't, there's all kinds of evidence against him. He can come up with an explanation for it, but it's not a good explanation. In the same way that you'd laugh out the defense attorney, I think you should laugh out the strong psychological egoist.